Right after our bitter divorce was finalized, my ex-husband Marcus dragged his 24-year-old mistress to a luxury car dealership just to rub his new wealth in my face. "Run the card for the $2 million McLaren," he announced to the entire showroom, wrapping his arm around her waist. "Consider it a parting gift to my boring ex-wife over there." He laughed boisterously, showing off for the staff and the cameras. But what Marcus did not know as he slapped his sleek black credit card on the counter was that his entire financial existence was currently resting in the palm of my hand. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to deal with an arrogant ex who severely underestimated your intelligence. I am Maya, and at 34 years old, I have learned that the loudest person in the room is usually the weakest. Let me take you back to that exact morning at the dealership, because the tension in that space was something you could practically cut with a knife. The air inside the showroom smelled of expensive Italian leather and highly polished floor wax. The ceilings were towering glass structures that let in the bright Chicago sunlight, reflecting off the hoods of cars that cost more than most people's houses. I was standing near a floor-to-ceiling window, quietly sipping a glass of sparkling water. I was not there to stop Marcus or to cause a dramatic scene. My presence was purely business. As an independent financial consultant who secretly managed a massive hedge fund, I was actually there because my investment firm owned the commercial building that this very dealership leased. I was conducting a routine property and asset audit, but Marcus did not know any of that. To him, I was just Maya, his discarded and allegedly boring ex-wife. The woman he left behind when his flashy tech startup suddenly hit a massive valuation, and he decided he needed a lifestyle upgrade. Marcus strode across the pristine showroom floor like he owned the entire city. He wore a loud, tailored designer suit that screamed new money, and his booming laughter echoed off the glass walls, practically demanding that every salesperson and customer stop and look at him. He was always the kind of man who needed an audience to feel important. Clinging tightly to his arm was Chloe. She was his Instagram-famous mistress who was now proudly wearing the title of official girlfriend. She strutted in wearing a tight bandage dress that left very little to the imagination. Her wrists were stacked heavily with gold Cartier bracelets. I recognized those bracelets instantly because he had bought them using our joint business account months before our divorce was even finalized. Marcus pointed his finger dramatically at the sleek silver McLaren sitting on a raised platform in the absolute center of the showroom. "I will take this one today," he boasted, his voice deliberately raised so that I would hear him from across the room. Chloe giggled loudly and immediately pulled out her phone. She started recording a video for her thousands of followers, making sure to pan the camera lens directly over to where I was standing by the window. She whispered something into Marcus's ear, and they both erupted into mocking laughter. Then she handed him her phone and strutted over to me. She swayed her hips with ridiculous exaggeration, her designer heels clicking sharply against the tile. She stopped a few feet away from me and looked me up and down. Her eyes rested heavily on my unbranded beige handbag. She let out a loud pitying sigh that was meant to be condescending. "You know, Maya," she purred, flipping her long, expensive hair extensions over her shoulder. "You really should use some of that alimony Marcus gave you to buy a real bag. That plain thing is just so basic. It is honestly embarrassing that you would walk into a high-end place like this looking like somebody's tired accountant. You really need to learn how to upgrade your life now that Marcus has clearly upgraded his." I looked down at my custom Hermes bag. It cost exactly $150,000, and it took a master artisan 2 years to hand-stitch it in Paris, precisely because it did not have a flashy logo plastered all over it. It was the absolute epitome of quiet wealth. It was the kind of bag that truly rich people recognized instantly, while people pretending to be rich thought it came from a mall. But I did not explain any of that to a 24-year-old girl whose entire net worth and personality were tied to my ex-husband's fleeting mood swings. I did not raise my voice. I did not cross my arms. I did not show a single ounce of insecurity or anger. I simply offered her a calm, flat smile. "Is that right?" I replied softly, my voice completely steady. "Well, I hope he buys you absolutely everything you think you deserve, Chloe." She rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed that she did not get a rise out of me. She spun around and marched back to Marcus. He was currently leaning heavily against the sales manager's glass desk. He slapped his heavy black premium credit card down on the glass with a dramatic flourish, making a loud smack that echoed in the quiet room. "Run it for the full $2 million, he demanded, making sure he turned his head to look right at me with a smug grin on his face. "No financing today. I want the keys in my hand right now so my girl can drive it off the lot." The sales manager was a nervous-looking older man in a tight gray suit. He picked up the heavy metal card with slightly trembling hands, clearly overwhelmed by Marcus's aggressive energy. "We deeply appreciate your business, Mr. Jenkins," he said, forcing a highly polite smile as he slid the black card into the payment terminal on his desk. I remained completely silent where I stood by the window. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. My expression was perfectly blank, but my eyes were fixed pointedly on the manager's shaking hands as he waited for the machine to process the massive payment. The small digital screen on the sleek payment terminal suddenly flashed a bright, aggressive red. A sharp error tone pierced the quiet atmosphere of the luxury showroom. It was a harsh, grating sound that immediately drew the attention of every single salesperson and customer in the immediate vicinity. The nervous sales manager swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly above his tight collar. He stared at the screen as if it had just insulted him personally. Then he looked up at Marcus with a deeply apologetic but terrified expression. "I am so sorry, Mr. Jenkins," he stammered, his voice dropping to a cautious whisper. "It seems the transaction has been declined. It is likely just a routine fraud alert due to the unusually high purchase amount. Sometimes these premium cards require verbal authorization for anything over $1 million. Marcus let out a loud, dramatic sigh of annoyance. He rolled his eyes and shook his head, looking at Chloe as if he were the victim of a terrible inconvenience. "These banks are absolutely ridiculous," he complained loudly, making sure everyone around him could hear his frustration. "You leave $5 sitting in a checking account, and they still treat you like a criminal when you try to spend your own money. Just run it again. Force the authorization through. Do you know how much business I do with your financing department? Run it again right now." The manager nodded quickly, wiping a fresh bead of sweat from his forehead. He pulled the heavy black metal card out of the machine, wiped the magnetic strip against his suit jacket, and inserted it for a second time. His fingers trembled as he typed in the $2 million purchase amount once more. The machine whirred quietly for 3 agonizing seconds, then the exact same sharp error tone echoed across the showroom floor. The screen flashed red again, but this time a specific error code appeared beneath the decline status. The manager physically recoiled from the desk. His professional retail smile completely vanished, replaced by a look of genuine discomfort. "Sir," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "the system is not asking for fraud verification. It is throwing a hard rejection code 04. That means the issuing bank has completely frozen the account." "What are you talking about?" Marcus snapped, his voice cracking slightly. His arrogant posture began to crumble. He snatched the black card off the glass desk and stared at it as if the metal itself had betrayed him. "That is a corporate black card tied directly to my tech startup. There is no spending limit. Your machine is broken. Try it again, or I will call the owner of this dealership and have you fired before lunch." "Sir, I assure you our systems are working perfectly," the manager replied, taking a defensive step back. "The prompt specifically says, 'Assets frozen by the board of directors. You will need to contact your corporate financial officer. There is nothing else I can do from my end.'" The words hung in the air like a heavy, dark cloud. Assets frozen by the board of directors. The entire showroom went dead silent. The other wealthy clients who had previously been annoyed by Marcus and his loud bragging were now openly staring at him with undisguised amusement. The ultimate humiliation in a room full of genuine wealth was being exposed as a fraud. Marcus began to sweat. The expensive fabric of his tailored suit suddenly looked stiff and uncomfortable on him. His chest heaved as panic finally broke through his carefully constructed facade of invincibility. Chloe dropped her phone. She had been recording the entire interaction for her social media followers, but her arm suddenly fell to her side. She looked at the sales manager and then turned her sharp gaze to Marcus. Her lips parted in shock. "Babe, what is he talking about?" she demanded, her voice losing all of its playful purring quality. "Why is your card declining? You promised me this car today." "Shut up, Chloe! Let me think!" Marcus snapped at her viciously. It was the first time I had ever heard him raise his voice at her. He completely dropped the generous billionaire sugar daddy persona. He pulled his smartphone out of his pocket, his fingers fumbling in his haste to unlock the screen. He immediately dialed his chief financial officer. Because the showroom was so quiet and Marcus was standing so close to the glass desk, I could hear the line ringing. When the CFO finally answered, Marcus did not even say hello. He just started screaming. "David, what the hell is going on with the corporate accounts?" Marcus yelled, pacing back and forth in front of the $2 million McLaren he could no longer afford. "I am trying to make a purchase, and the bank is telling me there is a board-level freeze. Call the bank and fix this right now. I am the CEO of this company." There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. When David finally spoke, his voice was completely devoid of the usual respect he gave Marcus. His tone was cold-tired and incredibly blunt. "I cannot do that, Marcus," David replied, his voice echoing slightly from the phone speaker. "Nobody can do that. Vanguard X just pulled their entire funding portfolio. They triggered the morality clause and the extreme debt covenants in our operating agreement. They initiated a hostile takeover 20 minutes ago." Marcus stopped pacing. Marcus. He stood frozen in the middle of the dealership, his eyes wide with absolute horror. "What do you mean, hostile takeover?" He breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "They cannot do that. I am the founder. I built this software. I own 40% of the equity." "You do not own anything anymore, Marcus." David fired back, his patience completely gone. "You leveraged all your equity to secure those massive personal loans. You have been bleeding the company dry to fund your private jets, your designer clothes, and your luxury vacations. Vanguard X found out about the embezzled funds. They called in the debt. Because you cannot pay it, they seized your shares. You have no equity left. You have no company left. You are completely locked out of the building, and the legal team is preparing to file criminal charges for corporate fraud. Do not call me again." The line went dead. Marcus stood there staring at his blank phone screen. He looked like a man who had just been shoved out of an airplane without a parachute. His breathing was shallow and ragged. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him in real time. He was an empty suit. He was a fake CEO propped up by investment funds, and now the people pulling the strings had just cut him loose. Chloe took a slow, deliberate step away from him. The gold Cartier bracelets on her wrists suddenly looked like the heavy shackles of a sinking ship. She grabbed her phone and quickly opened her banking app. I watched her face contort in absolute disgust. "My supplementary cards are blocked," she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the room. "Every single card you gave me is declining. The rent on the penthouse is due tomorrow, Marcus. Are you broke? Are you seriously standing here trying to buy me a $2 million car when you do not even have a job? Chloe, please just calm down," Marcus begged, reaching a hand out toward her. "It is just a misunderstanding with the board. I will call my lawyers. I can fix this." "Do not touch me," she snapped, slapping his hand away as if he were carrying a disease. "You are a liar and a fraud. I am not going down with you." She spun around on her designer heels and marched rapidly toward the exit, not looking back at him even once. She abandoned him the exact same way he had abandoned our marriage the moment things became inconvenient. Marcus was left standing completely alone in the center of the showroom. The sales manager quietly stepped away from the desk, wanting absolutely nothing to do with the unfolding disaster. Marcus slowly turned his head and his eyes locked onto mine. He looked at me standing calmly by the window holding my glass of sparkling water. A flicker of realization crossed his panicked face. He remembered the divorce settlement. He remembered the massive, anonymous hedge fund that had quietly bought up his company debt during our separation. I set my glass down on the small table next to me. The soft clink of the crystal was the only sound in my immediate radius. I smoothed the front of my tailored trousers, picked up my unbranded custom bag, and walked slowly across the pristine showroom floor. I did not rush. I walked with the steady, measured pace of a woman who had already won the war. I stopped right in front of him. He looked pathetic. The arrogant man who had loudly demanded attention just 10 minutes ago was now a trembling, hollow shell. "What did you do?" he whispered, his voice cracking. He was terrified of the answer. I looked him dead in the eye, my expression completely devoid of any pity or remorse. "You forgot to read the fine print in the divorce settlement, Marcus. I did not take your assets. I took your lifeline." To fully understand how perfectly that moment at the luxury car dealership destroyed him, you have to rewind exactly 48 hours. You have to see the absolute height of his arrogance before the spectacular fall. 2 days before the credit card declined, Marcus decided to throw what he called a divorce celebration at the massive estate we used to share. It was a sprawling 5,000-square-foot mansion sitting on 2 acres of meticulously landscaped property in one of the most exclusive gated communities in the city. The house was supposed to be our forever home, but it quickly became a monument to his massive ego. When I pulled up to the neighborhood that Friday night, the sheer volume of the party was already obnoxious. I could hear the heavy bass of the music thumping from 3 blocks away. The long circular driveway was completely packed with expensive cars, most of which were likely rented for the weekend just to keep up appearances. Marcus had actually hired a professional valet service to park cars on the front lawn, completely destroying the expensive imported grass he used to obsess over. There were blinding purple and blue uplights positioned all around the exterior of the house, making the elegant brick mansion look like a cheap downtown nightclub. I did not pull into the driveway. I parked my unassuming sedan quietly on a dark side street a few blocks down and walked the rest of the way. I was not dressed for a party. I wore a simple black turtleneck, dark jeans, and a tailored wool coat. I was not there to crash his ridiculous celebration. I was not there to cause a scene or confront his new mistress. I was there for one very specific reason. During the incredibly rushed and hostile move-out process a few weeks prior, the movers had accidentally left behind a single item in the upstairs guest bedroom. It was a hand-painted oil portrait of my grandmother, who we all called Big Mama. The painting showed her sitting on the front porch of her old house in Georgia, shucking peas with a gentle smile on her face. It was not worth millions of dollars to an art appraiser, but to me, it was completely irreplaceable. It was the only tangible piece of my family history I had left, and I knew Marcus well enough to know he would likely throw it in the trash just to spite me if he found it. I walked up the long stone pathway toward the massive double front doors, keeping my head down and avoiding the gaze of the intoxicated guests spilling out onto the front lawn. The air smelled of cheap champagne and expensive cigars. But before I could even reach the brass door handle, a figure stepped out from the shadows of the massive stone columns framing the porch. It was Tasha, my ex-husband's younger sister. Tasha was 32 years old, but she still acted like a spoiled teenager whose parents never told her no. She was wearing a sequined cocktail dress that was far too tight and a pair of designer heels that she was clearly struggling to balance in. In one hand, she held a crystal flute of champagne, and in the other, she held a lit cigarette. Standing right behind her, like a loyal, heavily gelled shadow, was her husband, Brad. Brad was a 35-year-old white man who constantly tried far too hard to fit into spaces he did not belong. He wore expensive loafers without socks and a tailored blazer over a vintage graphic t-shirt. Brad loved to use urban slang and act like he deeply understood the struggles of the black community, but the truth was, he was just a freeloading opportunist who loved spending Marcus's money. Well, look who decided to show up uninvited. Tasha slurred loudly, stepping directly into my path and blocking the front door. A cruel, smug smile stretched across her face. Her eyes scanned my simple outfit with absolute disgust. Did you not get the memo, Maya? This is a celebration of Marcus finally dropping dead weight. You are not on the guest list. I stopped on the top step, maintaining a perfectly calm distance from her. I have no interest in attending this party, Tasha, I said, my voice low and completely steady. The movers missed a box in the east guest room. It has a painting of my grandmother in it. I'm going to walk upstairs, grab it, and walk right back out. You will not even know I am here. Oh, absolutely not. Tasha laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed over the loud music playing from inside. You are not stepping 1 foot inside my brother's house. Do you think I am stupid, Maya? I know exactly why you are here. Brad stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on Tasha's shoulder, while looking down at me with a sickeningly condescending smile. Come on, Maya. he said, using a tone you would use to scold a confused child. "You really need to move on. It is honestly a little sad that you are showing up here tonight. Marcus is happy now. He is highly successful. You need to respect his boundaries and stop lingering around like you still own the place." I slowly shifted my gaze from Tasha to Brad. The absolute sheer audacity of this man standing on a porch. I paid the mortgage for telling me to respect boundaries was almost funny, but I did not laugh. I kept my face perfectly blank, a clinical mask of absolute indifference. "I am not lingering, Brad," I replied flatly. "I am retrieving my personal property. Now step aside." Tasha suddenly thrust her champagne glass toward me, spilling a few drops of the expensive liquor onto the stone porch. She leaned in close, her breath reeking of alcohol and misplaced arrogance. "You are not getting anything," she spat, her voice rising in pitch to draw the attention of the guests standing nearby. "We all know what you are really doing here. You saw the cars, you saw the valet, you saw how much money my brother is pulling in now that his company is blowing up, and you want a piece of it." I stared at her, letting the silence stretch for a few seconds. "I want a piece of it," I repeated softly. "Yes," Tasha yelled, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my chest. "You are a leech, Maya. A pathetic, jealous leech. You got your little alimony check and now you are back here trying to squeeze more cash out of him by pretending you care about some dusty old painting. You could never keep up with his ambition. You were always too basic, too boring, and too cheap. You spent your whole marriage holding him back, and now that he is finally free to be the king he is, you just cannot stand it." Several guests on the porch had stopped talking and were now openly staring at us. Tasha was clearly enjoying the audience. She thrived on this kind of toxic, dramatic energy. She felt powerful standing on the porch of a multi-million-dollar mansion that she did not own, defending a brother who she only loved because he funded her extravagant lifestyle. "You need to turn around and walk your broke self back down that driveway," Tasha sneered, taking another aggressive step toward me. "Because the gravy train is permanently closed. Marcus is a multimillionaire now. He is dating a gorgeous model. He is completely out of your league. So, take your cheap little sweater and get off his property before I call the security guards to physically drag you away." Brad nodded in agreement, crossing his arms over his chest and puffing himself up as if he were actually intimidating. "You heard her, Maya?" he said, a smug grin firmly plastered on his face. "It is time for you to leave. Do not make this any more embarrassing for yourself than it already is." I shifted my attention entirely to Brad. He stood there with his chest puffed out, an unearned confidence radiating from every pore of his body. Brad always fascinated me in the worst possible way. He was a man who brought absolutely nothing to the table, yet demanded to eat first. He loved to appropriate black culture when it was trendy, playing loud hip-hop at his suburban barbecues and using heavy urban slang when he was trying to sound tough around Marcus. But the moment he felt even slightly threatened, his true colors always bled through. He looked down at me from the top step, his pale face flushed with the cheap champagne he had been drinking all night on my ex-husband's dime. "Look, Maya," he continued, his tone shifting from fake sympathy to outright condescension. "We all know this transition has been really hard for you. But you and Marcus are just from two completely different worlds now. He is building a massive tech empire and rubbing shoulders with elite venture capitalists. You need to accept that you just do not fit into this high-level lifestyle anymore." I did not blink. "Which lifestyle is that, Brad?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet, but carrying clearly over the thumping music. "The one funded by maxed-out credit cards and corporate lies," Brad scoffed, shaking his head as if he were dealing with an unruly teenager. He took a heavy step closer down the stairs, invading my personal space just enough to try and intimidate me physically. "Come on, Maya," he sneered, dropping the nice guy act completely. "Stop pretending you belong here. Go back to your South Side hood. Marcus is upper echelon now. He has completely outgrown you, and he has definitely outgrown where you came from. So do us all a massive favor and walk away before we have to call someone to forcibly remove you." The words hung heavily in the humid night air. Go back to your South Side hood. It was a classic Brad move, a subtle classist and microaggressive racial dig wrapped in a thin veil of fake concern. He absolutely loved throwing my roots in my face whenever he felt insecure. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. My parents worked exhausting double shifts just to put food on our table, and I had to fight tooth and nail for every single academic scholarship and career opportunity I ever received. I built my entire financial consulting firm from the ground up, with nothing but a cheap laptop and sheer unbreakable willpower. Brad, on the other hand, was handed a lucrative trust fund at 21, blew every single penny of it on a failed tech startup by 24, and had been leeching off his wife's family ever since. The absolute irony of a freeloading white man standing on the porch of a massive house I helped finance, telling a self-made black woman to go back to the hood, was certainly not lost on me. The small crowd of party guests gathered near the open front doors suddenly went dead silent. The music was still thumping inside, but out on the porch you could hear a pin drop. Sits. Even Tasha looked slightly uncomfortable for a fraction of a second, realizing her husband had just crossed a very dangerous and highly offensive line in public. They all watched me closely, waiting for the angry black woman stereotype to jump out. They desperately wanted me to scream. They wanted me to throw a drink in his face. They wanted me to completely lose my temper so they could point their manicured fingers and validate everything they had been whispering about me behind my back. But I did not give them the satisfaction. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not clench my fists. Instead, the corners of my mouth slowly curled upward into a cold, calculated smirk. It was the kind of smile an apex predator gives right before it snaps the steel trap shut. I was standing in front of an arrogant man holding a loaded gun to my head, completely unaware that I had emptied the chamber months ago. Upper echelon, I repeated, letting the words roll around on my tongue like a fine vintage wine. That is a truly fascinating choice of words, Brad. Tell me, exactly what makes Marcus upper echelon? Is it the leased sports cars parked on the grass in the driveway? Is it the rented designer furniture staging the inside of this house? Or is it the simple fact that he is currently paying for the champagne you're sweating out of your pores right now? Brad's smug, confident smile faltered for a brief second. He shifted his weight uncomfortably, his expensive leather loafers scraping loudly against the stone porch. I am not going to stand here and debate my brother-in-law's massive success with a bitter, jealous ex-wife. He deflected, trying desperately to maintain his authority for the crowd. He is a CEO. He is a visionary. That is something you would not understand. I took one slow, deliberate step up the stairs, closing the distance between us. I did not break eye contact for a single second. My gaze was locked firmly onto his, stripping away every single layer of his fake bravado. "A visionary," I said, my voice dropping an octave so only he and Tasha could hear the absolute venom in my words. That is hilarious coming from a man who has not held a steady-paying job in over 5 years. You stand up here wearing tailored clothes bought with my ex-husband's money, drinking expensive liquor from a home bar I personally stocked, defending a lavish lifestyle you cannot even afford to look at without asking your wife for a weekly allowance. Tasha gasped loudly, her hand flying to her chest in theatrical shock. "How dare you speak to him like that?" she shrieked, her protective sisterly instincts kicking into overdrive. "Brad works incredibly hard. He is an entrepreneur." "An entrepreneur," I echoed, raising one perfectly arched eyebrow. "Right. The craft brewery, the big passion project. How is that going, by the way, Brad? Because from my professional understanding, brewing artisanal beer requires actual liquid capital. It requires a solid, sustainable business plan and a highly functional brain. 3 things you have historically lacked since the day I met you." Brad's face turned a violent shade of crimson red. He puffed his chest out again, trying to physically loom over my frame. "You do not know anything about my business." He spat, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of blind rage and sudden deep insecurity. "My brewery is on the verge of a major regional distribution deal. We are expanding rapidly. I am building a legacy brand while you are out here harassing your ex-husband for a dusty old painting because you have absolutely nothing else going on in your miserable, pathetic life." I let him finish his little desperate speech. I let him stand there and lie directly to his wife, to the wealthy guests, and to himself. I stood perfectly still, absorbing his pathetic attempts at insults, while my mind quickly calculated the exact trajectory of the financial grenade I was about to drop right in the middle of his fragile marriage. He wanted to talk about my South Side roots. He wanted to talk about being upper echelon. He wanted to pretend he was a highly successful businessman while sitting high on his fake horse. I reached into my tailored wool coat pocket and wrapped my fingers around my phone. I did not need to yell. I did not need to cause a physical altercation. I just needed to let the brutal truth do what it does best: destroy the lies. "You are expanding?" I asked, tilting my head slightly to the side. A small, genuinely amused laugh escaped my lips. "That is a very interesting way to describe your current financial situation, Brad. Very creative indeed. Because usually, when a legitimate business is expanding, the owner does not spend his Thursday afternoons crying in a commercial bank manager's office." Brad froze. The sudden mention of his commercial bank manager completely shattered his highly curated, confident facade. The pale flush of cheap champagne instantly vanished from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a ghost caught in the harsh headlights of an oncoming train. His mouth opened and closed a few times, but absolutely no sound came out. The aggressive physical posturing he had displayed just seconds ago melted away into absolute terror. Tasha frowned, her thick, drawn-on eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. "What are you talking about, Maya?" she snapped, but her voice lacked its previous venom. It was replaced by a sudden wavering doubt. Why would Brad be crying at a bank? "We just got approved for a massive facility expansion. We are buying new brewing equipment next week." I kept my eyes locked onto Brad, watching the cold sweat begin to gather at his receding hairline. "A facility expansion?" I repeated, letting a dry, humorless laugh escape my chest. "Tasha, your husband is not expanding anything except his massive high-interest debt portfolio. The Southside hood you both love to make fun of is exactly what is keeping you from living on the streets right now. Last month, Brad here practically begged on his hands and knees for a $300,000 loan extension for that pathetic craft brewery of his." Brad took a panicked step forward, raising both of his hands as if he could physically push the words back into my mouth. "Maya, shut up," he hissed frantically, looking around at the wealthy guests who were now hanging on to every single syllable. "You have absolutely no right to discuss my private financial matters out here in front of these people. This is illegal." I did not move an inch. "Private financial matters," I shot back, my voice ringing clear and authoritative over the distant heavy bass of the party music. "When you default on a commercial loan managed by my hedge fund, Brad, it stops being private and becomes my direct business. My firm acquired the regional distressed debt portfolio holding your brewery's paper 3 weeks ago. I read the exact transcripts of you crying to my loan officers. I saw the desperate emails you sent at 3 o'clock in the morning, begging for just another 30 days to make your employee payroll. You are completely bankrupt. You do not have a single dollar to your name." The silence on the massive stone porch was deafening. The wealthy guests who had previously been laughing at me were now staring at Brad with undisguised pity and deep disgust. In this specific high society circle, running out of money was the ultimate cardinal sin. But lying about it was completely unforgivable. But that was not the part that was going to truly destroy him. That was just the appetizer. I looked past his sweating, terrified face and made direct eye contact with Tasha. She was staring at her husband, her jaw practically resting on the stone floor, her champagne flute shaking in her trembling hand. "I am honestly surprised you let him do it, Tasha." I continued, my tone shifting to one of feigned casual curiosity. "I mean, I always knew you were blindly supportive of his little entrepreneurial hobbies, but allowing him to use your mother's house deed as collateral for a failing beer company was a very bold financial strategy. I guess Marcus does not know about that either." The words landed like a heavy mortar shell directly in the center of their fragile marriage. Tasha stopped breathing. The expensive crystal champagne flute slipped from her numb fingers and shattered into a dozen glittering pieces against the hard stone porch. The expensive imported liquor splashed violently across her designer heels, but she did not even blink. Her entire body went completely rigid as her brain desperately tried to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal I had just casually dropped at her feet. "My mother's deed," Tasha whispered, her voice sounding incredibly small and fragile in the heavy night air. She slowly turned her head to look at Brad. Brad, tell me she is lying. Tell me this jealous, bitter woman is making this up right now because she wants to ruin our night. Brad was physically shaking. He reached out to grab Tasha's arm, his eyes wide with wild animalistic desperation. Baby, I can explain everything, he stammered, his voice cracking pathetically. The regional distributor pulled out at the last minute. I just needed a temporary bridge loan to keep the vats running. I was going to pay it back before anyone even noticed the lien on the house. I swear to you, I was going to fix it before the bank sent the notice. You put a lien on our mother's house, Tasha screamed, the sound tearing out of her throat like a wounded animal. The house our father built with his own 2 hands, the house Marcus and I grew up in. You forged her signature to save your stupid, failed beer company. She did not wait for his answer or his pathetic excuses. Tasha lunged forward, closing the distance between them in a split second. She raised her hands and began beating her fists violently against Brad's chest and face. All of her polished high society etiquette completely evaporated into the night air. She was shrieking furiously, calling him every single profanity in the book while tearing viciously at his expensive tailored blazer. Brad stumbled backward frantically, trying to block her manicured nails from scratching his face, pleading with her to calm down and talk about it inside the house. But there was no going inside. The domestic war zone had already spilled out onto the front lawn. The wealthy party guests were now openly pulling out their smartphones eagerly, recording the spectacular downfall of the upper echelon couple who had spent the last 2 hours bragging about their immense wealth. Suddenly, the heavy double front doors swung open with a violent crash. Marcus stepped out onto the porch, holding a fresh glass of expensive bourbon, looking incredibly annoyed by the commotion interrupting his lavish divorce celebration. "What the hell is going on out here?" he roared, his deep voice easily cutting through the chaos. "Tasha, stop acting like a crazy person and let go of him right now. We have important venture capital investors out here." Tasha whipped her head around to face her brother, tears of pure, unadulterated rage streaming down her face, ruining her perfect, expensive makeup. "He stole from Mama," she screamed, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at Brad's bleeding, scratched face. "He took the deed to Mama's house and used it to get a $300,000 loan for his bankrupt brewery. He put a lien on Mama's house, Marcus. He lost the house." Marcus froze. The heavy crystal bourbon glass slipped from his grip and shattered right next to the remnants of Tasha's champagne flute, splashing brown liquor all over his designer shoes. He looked at Brad. He looked at Tasha, who was sobbing hysterically. Then his dark eyes locked onto me, standing perfectly calm and entirely untouched on the edge of the stone steps. He realized instantly that I was the one who had brought this devastating information to his doorstep. The physical transformation in Marcus was terrifying and instantaneous. The arrogant, polished tech CEO completely vanished, and the fiercely protective Southside brother violently emerged. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The thick veins in his neck bulged visibly against his tight white collar. "You put a lien on my mother's house, you parasitic piece of trash!" Marcus bellowed, his voice echoing loudly across the massive manicured lawn. Brad threw his hands up in absolute terror, backing away so fast he nearly tripped over the stone steps. "Marcus, please listen to me," he begged, his voice high-pitched and incredibly pathetic. "I can get the money back. I have a private investor lined up for next month. Just give me a week to sort out the legal paperwork." Marcus did not give him a week. He did not even give him a single second. He lunged forward with the blinding speed and raw aggression of a heavyweight fighter. He grabbed Brad by the lapels of his expensive vintage t-shirt and slammed him brutally against one of the massive stone columns framing the front porch. The sickening thud of Brad's head hitting the solid stone made several of the recording party guests gasp out loud in horror. Tasha was still screaming, but now she was frantically trying to pull Marcus off her husband, suddenly terrified that her brother was going to literally beat the life out of him right there on the porch. Brad was sobbing, openly begging for mercy, as Marcus drew his heavy fist back completely, ignoring his sister's frantic, desperate pleas. The entire front porch devolved into an absolute nightmare of screaming, crying, and violent physical struggling. the polished, perfect family image they had spent years carefully curating and throwing in my face was completely destroyed in less than 3 minutes, all because I decided to speak a few simple financial truths. I did not lift a single finger to stop the violence unfolding in front of me. I stood perfectly still on the edge of the stone steps, watching the spectacular collapse of a family that had spent years making me feel completely worthless. Marcus had Brad pinned against the massive decorative pillar, his heavy fists raining down as Brad shrieked and covered his bleeding face. Tasha was frantically pulling at her brother's expensive suit jacket, her false eyelashes peeling off from her hysterical crying. The wealthy party guests, the very same people Tasha had just been trying to impress, were all standing in a wide circle holding up their phones to record every single shameful second of the brawl. The flashing lights from their smartphone cameras illuminated the absolute destruction of the Jenkins family reputation in real time. I calmly adjusted my wool coat, stepped carefully around the shattered crystal of the broken champagne flute, and walked right through the open double front doors. The inside of the massive mansion was practically empty. The thumping party music was still blaring through the expensive surround sound system, but almost all the guests had rushed outside to watch the domestic war zone on the lawn. The air conditioning was running at full blast, making the sprawling foyer feel like an icebox. I walked past the rented designer furniture and the ridiculous modern art pieces Marcus had recently purchased to make himself look cultured. I made my way up the grand sweeping staircase, my footsteps completely silent on the thick plush carpet. I walked straight down the long hallway to the east guest bedroom. The movers had stripped the room bare except for one small cardboard box sitting completely forgotten in the far corner. I walked over and opened the flaps. Inside, wrapped in a thin layer of protective bubble wrap, was the oil portrait of Big Mama. I carefully pulled the painting out and held it up to the dim light of the bedroom. My grandmother's gentle painted smile looked back at me. She was sitting on her porch in Georgia looking peaceful and entirely content with her simple life. She did not need leased sports cars or fake high society friends to know her own worth. Holding that wooden frame in my hands, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of closure. The heavy, toxic weight I had been carrying for the last 5 years of my marriage completely vanished. I had exactly what I came for. I tucked the painting securely under my arm and walked back down the grand staircase. By the time I reached the front doors and stepped back out onto the stone porch, the violent physical altercation had finally been broken up. 2 large men who looked like venture capital investors had physically pulled Marcus away from his brother-in-law. Marcus was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his expensive tailored suit jacket completely ripped at the shoulder seam. He was angrily wiping a smear of Brad's blood off his knuckles with a white silk pocket square. Brad was sitting on the stone steps, clutching his bruised face and sobbing loudly like a child. Tasha was kneeling next to him, but she was not comforting him. She was furiously whispering at him, demanding to know how much debt they were actually in. The crowd of guests was murmuring in hushed, shocked tones. Their phones finally lowered, but the damage to Marcus's pristine corporate image was already permanently done. I walked slowly across the porch, my heels clicking sharply against the stone. The sharp sound drew Marcus's attention. He snapped his head toward me, his dark eyes burning with an intense mixture of humiliation and blinding rage. He hated that I had witnessed this. He hated that I was the one who pulled the pin on the grenade that destroyed his perfect celebration. But most of all, he hated that I looked completely unbothered while his entire world was spiraling into chaos. "Are you happy now?" Marcus spat, his voice dripping with venom as he took a threatening step toward me. "You came here to ruin my night, and you did it. Take your garbage painting and get off my property before I call the police for trespassing." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at his ruined suit, his bleeding knuckles, and his furious, sweating face. "You ruined your own night, Marcus," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and even. "I just provided the actual financial context, but do not worry, I am leaving. I just need one last thing from you before I walk out of your life forever." I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a thin black leather folder. I opened it and pulled out a single sheet of heavy legal paper, along with a silver luxury pen. I held the document out toward him. "What the hell is that?" he demanded, glaring at the paper as if it were coated in poison. "I am not signing anything else for you. My lawyers already gave you everything you asked for in the settlement." I let out a soft, dismissive sigh, playing perfectly into his massive, fragile ego. "It is the final equity release form, Marcus," I said, keeping my tone incredibly bored. "It formally relinquishes any residual claim I have to your startup shares now that the divorce is finalized. Since you are so busy building your massive tech empire and rubbing shoulders with the upper echelon, somehow, I figured you would want to cut all remaining financial ties with your boring ex-wife immediately. Just sign the bottom line and you are completely free." I knew exactly how his brain worked. Marcus was standing in front of his wealthy investors, humiliated and bleeding. He desperately needed to regain control of the situation. He needed to reassert his dominance and prove to the crowd that he was still the alpha male who did not care about me or my presence. Reading a legal document carefully in front of everyone would make him look weak and cautious. Dismissing me with a quick, arrogant signature would make him look powerful and unbothered. Marcus let out a loud, arrogant scoff. He snatched the silver pen from my hand with aggressive force. "You think I am worried about you claiming my shares?" He mocked loudly, ensuring the remaining crowd could hear his bravado. "You are a joke, Maya. You are nothing but a minor inconvenience in my rearview mirror." He did not even glance at the text on the page. He did not read a single paragraph. He just slapped the heavy paper against the stone pillar next to him and aggressively scribbled his signature on the bottom line. He practically threw the pen and the paper back at my chest. "There!" He sneered, a smug, triumphant smile returning to his bruised face. "You are officially cut off. No more handouts. No more riding my coattails. Now take your little painting and get the hell out of my sight. Happy freedom, Maya." I caught the paper gracefully midair. I looked down at the fresh, wet ink of his signature on the dotted line. A deep, profound sense of victory washed over my entire body, but I kept my face completely devoid of emotion. I carefully placed the document back into the black leather folder and slipped it into my coat pocket. "Happy freedom, Marcus," I replied softly. I turned my back on him. I walked down the stone steps, completely ignoring Brad, who was still sobbing on the ground, and Tasha, who was glaring daggers at my back. I walked down the long circular driveway, past the rented luxury cars and the whispering guests. I did not look back at the massive mansion. I just kept walking straight into the cool, dark night, holding my grandmother's painting securely under my arm. Marcus went back to his ruined party, genuinely believing he had just successfully discarded me. He genuinely believed he had just signed a routine divorce release form. He had absolutely no idea that in his desperate, arrogant attempt to look powerful in front of a crowd, he had not bothered to read the header of the document. He did not know that he had just officially signed over his ultimate executive voting rights to Vanguard X. He did not know that he had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to legally execute a hostile takeover of his entire company. After I walked out of that luxury car dealership, leaving Marcus standing completely frozen next to a $2 million McLaren, he could not buy the reality of his situation finally kicked in. He sprinted out of the showroom, completely abandoning Chloe without a single second thought, and jumped into his leased luxury sport utility vehicle. He drove like an absolute madman, weaving recklessly through heavy downtown Chicago traffic and running 2 red lights in his sheer desperation to get to his corporate headquarters. The leather steering wheel felt slippery under his sweating palms. His chest was heaving and he was gasping for air as if he were physically drowning in his own expensive tailored suit. His mind was racing, frantically trying to convince himself that it was just a massive banking error, a temporary hold, a simple misunderstanding with the board of directors. He had built this software company from a tiny shared office space in the suburbs into a massive, sleek glass tower in the financial district. He was the founder. He was the visionary tech genius. No one could just take his entire empire away from him in a single afternoon. It was legally impossible. It had to be a mistake. He pulled up to the towering glass building, slamming on his brakes and parking his car illegally right in the red fire lane with the engine still running. He rushed through the heavy revolving doors and stepped into the pristine marble lobby. The space was a massive monument to his own narcissism. He had personally approved the imported Brazilian marble floors, the 2-story-high digital waterfall, and the massive company logo laser-cut into the polished stone walls. He marched straight toward the secure executive elevators, pulling his silver lanyard from his pocket. He slapped his custom gold-rimmed ID badge against the black security scanner. He expected the familiar pleasant green beep that always welcomed the chief executive officer and parted the thick glass gates. Instead, the machine let out a harsh, flat buzz. The small LED indicator flashed a bright, angry red. Access denied. Marcus frowned deeply. He aggressively wiped the plastic card on his sleeve, thinking it was just a smudge on the magnetic strip, and slapped it against the scanner a second time. Another loud buzz echoed through the quiet, cavernous lobby. Another red flash. Access denied. He slammed his heavy fist against the thick glass turnstile, his rising panic rapidly boiling over into blind, irrational rage. He turned and screamed at the lobby security guard, demanding that he manually override the system immediately. But the guard did not scramble to his feet. He did not apologize or pick up his radio to call for technical support. He just looked at Marcus with a cold mixture of pity and strict professional detachment, keeping his hands firmly planted on his desk. Before Marcus could completely lose his mind and physically jump over the security turnstile, the private executive elevator dinged. The polished steel doors slid open, and David stepped out. David was the chief financial officer. He was a ruthless, brilliant numbers guy who had helped Marcus secure his early venture capital funding. But their working relationship had rapidly deteriorated over the last year as Marcus started bleeding the company accounts dry to fund his lavish personal lifestyle. David was not alone. He was flanked by two massive corporate security contractors in dark suits. One of the contractors was holding a small brown cardboard box containing the few personal items Marcus had kept on his massive mahogany desk. David did not look panicked. He did not look worried. He looked completely relieved. "David, what the hell is going on with the security system?" Marcus roared, stepping right up to the glass barrier. "Tell this idiot guard to let me up right now. The bank is blocking my corporate cards and telling me there is a board-level freeze on my accounts. Call legal right now and get it fixed before I fire both of you." David stopped on the other side of the glass turnstile. He did not swipe his badge to let Marcus through. He slowly adjusted his glasses and looked at Marcus the exact same way a scientist looks at a dead insect on a microscope slide. "Legal is not going to help you, Marcus," David replied, his voice echoing coldly across the marble lobby. "Legal is the department that drafted your termination papers this morning. You do not work here anymore. Your position as chief executive officer has been terminated with cause effective immediately." Marcus grabbed the edge of the glass barrier, his knuckles turning stark white from the pressure. "Terminated." He spat the word out, as if it were a physical poison burning his tongue. "You cannot terminate me. I own 40% of the equity. I am the founder of this company. I am your boss, David." "Not anymore." David fired back, stepping closer to the glass, his voice dropping into a deadly serious corporate monotone. "You were the boss until you committed a gross breach of fiduciary duty. Vanguard X ordered a comprehensive forensic audit of our accounts last week. They found the massive financial discrepancies, Marcus. They found the offshore wire transfers you used to buy that luxury penthouse for your mistress. They found the forged expense reports for your private jet rentals and your fake business trips. You have been actively engaged in reckless financial malfeasance and actively embezzling corporate funds for the last 8 months. You completely violated the indemnification clauses of your own contract." Marcus opened his mouth to shout another aggressive defense, but the lies completely died in his throat. His face turned a sickly pale shade of gray. He realized instantly that they knew absolutely everything. The walls were rapidly closing in. "Because of your gross financial misconduct, Vanguard X triggered the extreme debt covenants in our operating agreement," David continued, his tone completely merciless. "They pierced the corporate veil. They called in the massive personal loans you secured using your own equity as collateral. Because you are completely broke and cannot repay a single dollar of that debt, they executed a hostile takeover. They legally seized every single one of your shares to cover the massive deficit you created." "You cannot just execute a hostile takeover without a majority board vote," Marcus screamed desperately, grasping at the remaining shreds of his corporate knowledge. I hold the supreme voting rights. You need my physical signature on a release form to authorize a massive equity transfer like that. You are bluffing." David let out a dry, humorless laugh. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp photocopy of a legal document. He pressed the paper flat against the glass turnstile so Marcus could clearly read the text. It was the exact same document I had handed to Marcus on the front porch of his mansion during his lavish divorce party. The document he had aggressively signed without reading a single word, just to look powerful and unbothered in front of his wealthy guests and his bleeding brother-in-law. "You gave them your signature, Marcus," David said, tapping the glass directly over the bold black ink of Marcus's messy, arrogant signature. "You signed an irrevocable transfer of your controlling voting shares 2 nights ago. You legally surrendered your entire stake in this company and your seat on the board to the Vanguard X Management Trust. The board convened an emergency meeting and voted unanimously this morning to remove you from the premises. You are officially locked out." Marcus stared at the photocopy of his own signature. His vision blurred as the horrifying reality of his own massive arrogance finally crushed the breath out of his lungs. He remembered the party music thumping in the background. He remembered wanting to show off. He had handed me the loaded gun, and he had pulled the trigger himself. "I highly suggest you step away from the building," David said, gesturing to the 2 massive security guards, who immediately stepped forward, rolling their shoulders. "Your corporate health insurance has been permanently canceled. Your company vehicle lease has been legally revoked. If you attempt to enter this property again, we will have you arrested for criminal trespassing. The board is also legally obligated to forward the complete findings of the forensic audit to the federal authorities. You are looking at serious federal prison time for corporate fraud and embezzlement. Have a nice life, Marcus." David turned his back and walked calmly toward the elevator, leaving the cheap cardboard box of Marcus's personal items sitting on the cold marble floor. Marcus stood completely paralyzed on the wrong side of the security glass. He was entirely stripped of his executive title, his stolen wealth, and his fake power. He had absolutely nothing left. While Marcus was standing in the cold marble lobby of the company he no longer owned, I was sitting in a plush velvet massage chair at an exclusive nail salon in the Gold Coast neighborhood. The air in the salon smelled of lavender and expensive essential oils, completely masking the toxic chaos I had just unleashed across town. My nail technician was carefully painting a sheer nude polish onto my acrylics. Soft jazz music was playing quietly from the hidden ceiling speakers. Several other wealthy women were sitting nearby sipping complimentary mimosas and reading magazines. It was the absolute picture of peace and tranquility. Then my phone started vibrating furiously on the marble side table next to me. The screen lit up with Marcus's name flashing brightly against the dark glass. I let it ring. I watched the screen go dark and then immediately light up again. He was calling back-to-back, completely frantic. My nail technician looked at the phone and then up at me with a polite, questioning glance. "Go ahead and keep painting," I told her, my voice soft and relaxed. "I'm just going to put this on speaker." I reached over with my free hand and tapped the green answer button, hitting the speaker icon immediately after. I did not even say hello. I just let the silence stretch across the line. "Maya," Marcus screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of pure hysteria and absolute rage. The sound of his screaming was so loud that it startled the woman sitting 2 chairs down from me. "What did you do to my company? What did you do to my life?" The entire salon went completely quiet. The soft jazz music suddenly seemed very faint compared to the sound of a grown man having a complete psychological breakdown over a cell phone speaker. Every single woman in the room stopped talking, lowered their magazines, and tuned in to the free entertainment. I inspected the fresh coat of polish on my left hand, completely unbothered by his screaming. "I did exactly what I promised I would do, Marcus," I replied, my tone clinical and detached. "I finalized our divorce." "You stole my shares," he roared, the sound of his heavy breathing echoing through the phone. "David just told me Vanguard X executed a hostile takeover and seized all my equity. He said they are forwarding a forensic audit to the federal authorities. You set me up. You used some shady anonymous trust fund to steal everything I built from the ground up. I am going to sue you. I am going to have you thrown in prison for fraud." I let out a soft, genuinely amused laugh. It was the kind of laugh you give a child who just told a ridiculous, easily disproven lie. "You are going to sue me?" I asked, shaking my head slowly. "Marcus, you do not even have enough liquid cash in your checking account to buy a bus ticket home right now, let alone hire a corporate defense attorney. And you certainly did not build anything from the ground up. You just took all the credit for the foundation I quietly poured for you." "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The aggressive edge was quickly melting away into pure confusion. "Did you honestly think your struggling little software startup miraculously received a $10 million venture capital injection last year because you are some kind of rare visionary genius?" I asked, stripping away the last remaining layer of his massive ego. "Did you really believe those high-level investors just fell out of the sky right when you were 2 weeks away from declaring bankruptcy and shutting your doors?" There was a dead silence on the other end of the line. I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head as his incredibly fragile reality shattered into a million pieces. "Vanguard X is my private trust, Marcus, is my private," I stated clearly, making sure every single word landed like a physical blow. "I created that management firm using my own consulting revenue. When your company was actively failing last year, when you were crying in our kitchen because you were about to lose everything, I stepped in. I used the trust to buy up your debt and inject the cash you desperately needed to stay afloat. I saved your professional life. I was your anonymous angel investor." He let out a choked, gasping sound. He was hyperventilating, standing alone on the sidewalk outside his former building while the cold Chicago wind whipped around him. "But you did not know it was me," I continued, my voice remaining as smooth as glass. "Because if you knew your wife saved you, your fragile little ego could not have handled it. You took that $10 million and you suddenly believed you were a tech god. You started treating me like I was beneath you. You started sleeping with a 24-year-old Instagram model. You used my money, the money I quietly invested to save your dream, to buy her Cartier bracelets and rent luxury penthouses. You funneled corporate funds into offshore shell accounts to pay for fake business trips to Miami so you could sleep with her on a yacht." "Maya, please." He begged, his tone completely shifting from aggressive rage to absolute pathetic desperation. "You have to stop this. You are my wife. We can fix this. I will fire David. I will leave Chloe right now. I will do whatever you want. Just call the board and give me my shares back." "I am not your wife anymore, Marcus," I reminded him coldly, "and you no longer have any shares to give back. You handed them to me yourself." "I did not hand you anything," he sobbed. "You tricked me." "I did not trick you," I shot back, my voice sharpening just a fraction. "I walked up to you on the front porch of your massive rented mansion, right in front of your wealthy friends and your bleeding brother-in-law. I handed you a legal document. I even told you it was an equity release form. But you were so desperate to look powerful. You were so eager to show off and prove how little you cared about me that you aggressively signed it without reading a single word. That paper you signed at your little divorce party was a complete unconditional transfer of your executive voting rights. You legally handed me the keys to the kingdom because you were too arrogant to look down at the paper in your own hand." The nail technician sitting across from me paused, her brush staring at my phone, with her mouth slightly open in pure shock. The other women in the salon were completely motionless, hanging on to every single syllable. "You did this to yourself, Marcus," I said, my tone dropping to a deadly clinical whisper. "You committed corporate fraud, you embezzled funds, and then you legally authorized the board to terminate you for cause. I did not ruin your life. I just handed you the rope and let you tie the knot yourself." "Please, Maya!" he wailed, practically screaming into the phone, tears completely destroying his arrogant facade. "They are going to send me to federal prison. They are going to lock me up. You cannot do this to me. I have nothing left." "Then you finally know exactly how it feels," I replied. I reached over and pressed the red button, ending the call instantly. I did not block his number yet. I wanted him to try calling back and hear it ring into the void. The salon was incredibly quiet. I looked down at my nail technician, who was still frozen, holding the small brush in her hand. "The color looks perfect," I told her, offering a warm, polite smile. "You can go ahead and apply the top coat now." She blinked rapidly, nodding her head and quickly going back to work. I leaned back into the plush velvet massage chair and closed my eyes, letting the soft jazz music wash over me. The war was officially over, and the silence of my victory was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. While Marcus was experiencing the absolute destruction of his professional life on the cold pavement outside his former office, Chloe was completely oblivious to his spectacular downfall. She had left the McLaren dealership highly annoyed but not particularly worried. In her deeply materialistic mind, Marcus was still a multimillionaire tech CEO who was just experiencing a temporary banking glitch. To soothe her bruised ego and calm her nerves, she took a luxury rideshare directly to Oak Street, which was Chicago's premier high-end shopping district. She strutted into the Dior boutique, acting as if she owned the entire commercial block. For the next 45 minutes, she paraded around the pristine showroom, pointing at expensive leather handbags, silk scarves, and a pair of $2,000 boots. She demanded that the sales associates bring her absolutely everything in her size, treating the staff like her own personal servants. She piled her selections high onto the illuminated glass counter, fully expecting to walk out with armfuls of thick designer shopping bags, just like she always did when she was spending Marcus's money. When the grand total came to just over $14,000, she confidently pulled out the black supplementary corporate card Marcus had given her. It was the exact same heavy metal card that had just failed so miserably at the car dealership. She assumed Marcus had already yelled at his bank manager and fixed the problem because that was what rich men did. But when the sales associate swiped the card through the boutique terminal, the machine beeped a loud, aggressive red. The associate frowned, her professional smile faltering slightly, and tried swiping it a second time. Declined. Chloe huffed in loud, dramatic annoyance and dug into her designer purse, pulling out a platinum credit card tied directly to Marcus's personal checking account. She slapped it onto the glass counter. The associate swiped it. Declined. Chloe's heart began to race. She pulled out a third card, a gold rewards card, and shoved it toward the associate. Declined. The sales associate carefully handed the useless plastic cards back to her, offering that specific polite but deeply condescending smile reserved entirely for people who are pretending to be wealthy. The associate quietly suggested that Chloe might want to contact her financial institution. Chloe felt her face burn bright red with intense humiliation as several other wealthy shoppers in the boutique stopped browsing and began to openly stare at her. The illusion of her upper echelon lifestyle was shattering in public. She snatched her cards off the glass counter, grabbed her purse, and stormed out of the boutique completely empty-handed, leaving a massive pile of $14,000 worth of merchandise behind. She stood on the busy Chicago sidewalk, her hands shaking with absolute fury as she dialed Marcus's number. She was ready to scream at him for embarrassing her. He answered on the second ring, but he did not sound anything like the arrogant, powerful man she had been sleeping with for the last 8 months. He sounded completely broken. He was actively sobbing into the phone, gasping for air like a drowning man holding onto a piece of driftwood. Chloe did not care that he was crying. She possessed absolutely no emotional depth or genuine empathy. She only cared about the public humiliation she had just endured inside that boutique. "Marcus, what the hell is going on with your accounts?" She shrieked, her voice shrill and demanding, completely ignoring the concerned looks of pedestrians walking past her on the street. "Every single card you gave me is completely blocked. I just had to walk out of Dior looking like an absolute beggar because your plastic keeps bouncing. Call the bank and tell them to lift the freeze right now. I am not playing these games with you today." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. The only sound was the distant noise of downtown traffic and Marcus's ragged, wet breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a pathetic, raspy whisper. "I do not have a bank to call Chloe." He choked out the words, sounding as if they were physically tearing his throat apart. "It is all gone. Everything is completely gone." Chloe stopped walking. The busy sounds of the city seemed to fade entirely into the background as a cold spike of dread pierced her chest. "What do you mean, everything is gone?" she demanded, her voice dropping to a harsh, flat tone, devoid of any affection. "Maya took the company." Marcus wept the words pouring out of him in a panicked, incoherent rush. "Vanguard X is her private trust. She owned all the corporate debt. She executed a hostile takeover this morning and seized every single one of my shares. I am locked out of the building. I am completely broke, Chloe. I do not even have a job. The board fired me for cause, and they are talking about filing federal embezzlement charges against me by the end of the week. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy and profoundly toxic. Chloe did not offer him a single word of comfort. She did not tell him that they would get through this devastating crisis together, or that her love for him was vastly stronger than his bank account balance. She was a 24-year-old opportunist who had strategically traded her youth and her beauty for a heavily funded luxury lifestyle. The moment the funding was permanently cut, the transaction was officially over. "You are broke," she repeated the word, tasting like absolute poison in her mouth. "You let your boring, plain ex-wife steal a $100 million company right out from under you while you were busy trying to buy me a car. You are completely pathetic." Marcus pleaded with her through the phone, crying and begging her to just come meet him at a coffee shop so they could figure it all out together. He was desperately clinging to the delusion that she actually cared about him as a human being. But Chloe was already standing on the edge of the curb, aggressively hailing a passing taxi. "Figure it out," she scoffed, her voice dripping with pure, unfiltered disgust. "There is absolutely nothing to figure out, Marcus. The corporate lease on the luxury penthouse you rented for me is up for renewal next week. The rent is $10,000 a month. Are you going to pay that astronomical bill with your tears? Are you going to buy my groceries and my clothes with your pending federal criminal charges? You are a complete fraud, and you nearly dragged me down with you. Do not ever call this number again." She ended the call right in the middle of his pathetic, desperate sobbing and immediately blocked his number from her phone. She jumped into the back of the yellow taxi and shouted the address of the high-rise luxury condo. By the time she unlocked the heavy mahogany front door of the penthouse, she was already moving in a state of blind, frantic panic. She was not incredibly smart, but she knew exactly how corporate housing worked. She knew that if the company had been legally seized by a hostile board, the corporate lease on this expensive apartment would be canceled immediately. The building security would likely be up to evict her and change the locks within 24 hours. She sprinted into the massive walk-in closet and pulled 3 massive designer suitcases from the top shelf, throwing them open violently on the king-size bed. She did not bother carefully folding anything. She just started violently shoving thousands of dollars worth of silk dresses, designer shoes, and expensive handbags into the luggage. She ripped the gold Cartier bracelets off her wrists and tossed them into a hidden travel safe inside her bag. She swept all the expensive perfumes and cosmetics off the bathroom vanity. She was not going to stick around to hold the hand of a bankrupt criminal facing federal prison time. She was a survivor in the most parasitic sense of the word. She zipped the heavy suitcases shut, grabbed her passport from the nightstand, and walked straight out of the condo, leaving the keys sitting abandoned on the marble kitchen counter. She was already mentally scrolling through her phone contacts, looking for her next wealthy target. Chloe stood in the massive foyer of the luxury penthouse, flanked by her 3 heavy designer suitcases. Her mind was operating like a cold, highly efficient calculating machine. She had exactly $400 in physical cash inside her designer wallet and a small handful of completely maxed-out personal credit cards. She needed a new financial host, and she needed one immediately before her current lavish lifestyle evaporated completely into thin air. She pulled out her smartphone and opened her extensive contact list. Her manicured thumb scrolled rapidly past nightclub promoters, local DJs, and low-level social media influencers. None of them had the kind of liquid capital she required to maintain her extremely high standard of living. She needed someone established. She needed someone desperate enough to overlook her sudden availability and wealthy enough to put her up in a nice hotel by tonight. Then her thumb stopped. She stared at a specific name she had saved in her phone a few months ago. After a highly uncomfortable, intense corporate dinner, Brad Jenkins. Technically, his last name was not Jenkins, but she had saved him under Marcus's family umbrella, just to remember who he was. She vividly remembered Brad. He was Tasha's husband. He was the loud, overly confident white guy who owned a local craft brewery and constantly talked about his massive regional expansion plans. During that specific dinner, Brad had spent the entire evening staring inappropriately at Chloe's chest whenever Tasha was looking the other way. He had even managed to casually slip Chloe his personal phone number under the table, whispering that she should let him know if she ever wanted a private after-hours tour of his brewing facilities. At the time, she had completely ignored his sleazy advances because Marcus was the one paying her astronomical bills. But now the situation had drastically changed. In her incredibly shallow and highly materialistic mind, a white man who owned a commercial brewery and had married into a wealthy tech family automatically meant he possessed deep pockets and secure trust fund money. She had absolutely no idea that Brad was currently drowning in massive high-interest commercial debt. She did not know he had just been violently beaten on a front porch for secretly mortgaging his mother-in-law's house. To Chloe, he was just a fresh wallet waiting to be opened. She tapped his name and opened a blank text message thread. She typed out a carefully crafted, highly suggestive message designed to stroke his fragile ego. "Hey, Brad, it is Chloe. Things are getting incredibly crazy over here with Marcus, and I am feeling really overwhelmed and scared. I just need a strong older man to talk to right now. Are you around?" She hit send and waited, watching the screen closely. Less than 30 seconds later, the 3 gray typing dots appeared at the bottom of her screen. Brad replied almost immediately. "Hey, Chloe, I am so sorry you are dealing with this massive mess. I am actually sitting at a hotel bar downtown right now, dealing with my own intense family drama. Tasha and I are having major issues. I would absolutely love to buy you a drink and make sure you are okay. Let me know where you are, and I will send a premium car for you." A cold, triumphant smile stretched across Chloe's perfect face. Men were so incredibly predictable and exceptionally weak. She quickly typed back a confirmation, saving the luxury hotel address, and grabbed the heavy leather handle of her largest suitcase. But before she could even take a single step toward the private elevator, the heavy front door of the penthouse suddenly unlocked. The brass handle turned and the door swung open. Marcus stumbled inside. He looked like an absolute disaster. The man who had been loudly demanding attention at a luxury car dealership just 2 hours ago was completely gone. His expensive tailored suit was deeply wrinkled and stained with nervous sweat. His silk tie was violently loosened around his neck, and his eyes were bloodshot and completely hollow. He stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the 3 massive suitcases sitting in the middle of the polished marble foyer. The last tiny shred of hope he had been desperately clinging to completely shattered. He looked from the bags up to Chloe's cold, indifferent face. "Chloe," he whispered, his voice breaking pathetically into a ragged sob. "Where are you going? Please do not do this to me right now. We can fix this. I am going to call my corporate lawyers. We can fight her in court. I can get my shares back." Chloe rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, harsh sigh of extreme annoyance. "There is no we, Marcus," she snapped, her voice echoing coldly in the empty, high-ceilinged space. "You are a bankrupt criminal. Your own board of directors locked you out of your own building. Your boring ex-wife owns absolutely everything you thought you had. I am not spending the best years of my youth sitting in a dingy courtroom watching you get sentenced to federal prison. We are completely done." Marcus dropped to his knees right there on the hard marble floor. He reached out and grabbed the edge of her expensive silk dress, tears streaming freely down his face. "Please," he begged, sobbing uncontrollably. "You are all I have left. I love you. Do not touch me," she hissed violently, slapping his hands away as if he were covered in a toxic disease. She stepped back, smoothing out the fabric of her dress, with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You do not love me, Marcus. You loved showing me off to make yourself feel like a big man, and I loved the penthouse and the shopping sprees. But the money is gone, and so am I." Oh, and she reached into her designer purse and pulled out the heavy metal apartment keys. She tossed them carelessly onto the marble console table next to the door. They hit the stone surface with a loud, sharp clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Have a nice life, Marcus," she said, entirely devoid of any human emotion. She turned her back on him, dragging her heavy suitcases out the front door and letting it slam shut heavily behind her. Marcus was left kneeling in absolute silence. He stared at the closed wooden door for a very long time. The profound, crushing weight of his absolute failure finally drove him completely insane. The desperate sadness and the suffocating panic rapidly mutated into a blinding, toxic rage. In his deeply narcissistic mind, none of this was his fault. He completely refused to accept that his blatant embezzlement, his arrogant behavior, and his endless infidelity had destroyed his own life. His ego simply could not process the reality of his own actions. He desperately needed a scapegoat. He needed someone else to blame for the total annihilation of his fake empire, and the only target available was the woman who had masterminded his downfall. He slowly stood up, his breathing changing from ragged sobs to deep, angry lungfuls of air. His hands curled into tight, shaking fists. He pulled out his smartphone and frantically dialed his mother's number. He paced back and forth across the foyer like a caged animal waiting for her to pick up. When she finally answered, her voice was weak and trembling, still deeply traumatized by the violent fight on the porch and the revelation of her stolen house deed. "Mom, listen to me very carefully." Marcus ordered, his voice shaking with pure, unadulterated hatred. "I just found out the truth about everything. Maya set us all up. She planned this entire thing from the very beginning. She is the anonymous trust fund that owns Brad's commercial brewery debt. She is the exact person foreclosing on your house right now." His mother gasped loudly over the phone, letting out a sharp cry of disbelief. "What are you saying? Marcus, Maya took my house." "She took everything!" Marcus screamed, spitting the words out as his rage completely consumed him. "She illegally stole my entire company this morning. She manipulated the board and froze all my corporate accounts. She is actively trying to destroy our entire family out of pure, bitter jealousy because I moved on and found someone better. She wants us all out on the street." There was a heavy pause on the line before his mother spoke again, her tone shifting from sorrow to deep, protective anger. "What do we do, Marcus? She cannot just steal from this family. Call Tasha and Brad right now." Marcus commanded, his eyes burning with a manic, dangerous energy. "Tell Brad I do not care about the fight anymore. Tell them we have a much bigger problem to deal with. Tell them to meet us in the lobby of Maya's downtown penthouse building in exactly 30 minutes. We are going over there as a united family, and we are not leaving her building until that bitter woman gives us back absolutely everything she stole." Exactly 30 minutes later, 3 aggressive vehicles screeched to a halt outside the gleaming glass facade of my downtown residential building. The heavy revolving doors spun violently as Marcus led his chaotic, toxic family into the pristine, ultra-exclusive lobby. The visual contrast was absolutely jarring. The lobby was a masterpiece of quiet luxury, featuring imported Italian marble floors, massive modern art installations, and a towering living wall of exotic orchids. The air smelled faintly of expensive cedar and citrus. Into this perfectly serene environment burst 4 people who looked and acted like they had just survived a drunken bar brawl. Marcus was sweating profusely, his designer suit still deeply wrinkled and missing its silk tie. His eyes were wild and desperate, constantly darting around the massive room. Tasha was stomping right behind him, her heavy makeup smeared from crying earlier, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the polished stone. Brad dragged himself along looking absolutely pathetic, with a massive purple bruise forming on his cheekbone and a torn vintage shirt hanging off his shoulders. He clearly did not want to be there. He just wanted to go hide in a cheap hotel room with Chloe. But his furious wife had practically dragged him by his collar to form this united family front. And bringing up the rear was Marcus's mother, clutching her oversized designer purse tightly to her chest, her face pinched into a mask of deep, righteous indignation. They marched directly toward the massive, curved mahogany security desk. The head concierge, a tall, impeccably dressed man named Charles, immediately stood up. He possessed that specific brand of icy professional politeness reserved exclusively for dealing with unruly people in high-income tax brackets. Marcus slammed his hands down on the polished mahogany. "Call up to the penthouse right now," he demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the cavernous space. "Tell Maya Jenkins her family is down here and we are coming up. We have a massive legal dispute to settle, and I am not leaving this lobby until she comes down here and faces me like an adult." Charles did not even blink. He looked calmly at Marcus's disheveled appearance and then tapped a few keys on his computer terminal. "I am sorry, sir," he replied, his voice incredibly smooth and entirely unbothered. "Miss Jenkins has explicitly placed you on the restricted access list. I cannot permit you to access the private elevators under any circumstances. I must ask you to lower your voice, or I will be forced to call building security to escort all of you back outside." This was the exact moment Marcus's mother decided to deploy her ultimate weapon, the manipulative family guilt trip. She pushed her way past her son and slapped her hand against her chest, looking at Charles with wide, tear-filled eyes. "You listen to me, young man," she scolded, her voice trembling with highly manufactured emotion. "I am her mother-in-law. I am family. And in the Black community, family always comes first, no matter what kind of silly little disagreement is happening behind closed doors. That girl upstairs is my daughter. She ate at my dining table every Sunday for 5 years. I treated her like my own flesh and blood, even when she was just a struggling girl from the South Side who did not know anything about our lifestyle. And this is how she repays my love. By secretly buying the debt on my house, by letting my own son-in-law ruin my financial stability. She has a strict moral obligation to fix this right now. You pick up that phone and you tell her that the woman who took her in is standing down here freezing and demanding to be treated with basic human respect." Tasha chimed in immediately, her ridiculous sense of entitlement flaring up to maximum capacity. "Yeah, you need to let us up right now," she shrieked, pointing a sharp, manicured finger directly at the concierge. "She stole my brother's entire tech company this morning. She is a corporate criminal. She is trying to leave my entire family out on the street out of pure, bitter jealousy. We are the actual victims here. If you do not give us the elevator access key right now, I am calling the police and reporting a massive, grand larceny right inside your precious little lobby. You are going to be an accessory to a federal crime." Brad just stood there, shifting his weight uncomfortably, looking nervously at the 2 massive security guards who were slowly beginning to converge on the front desk. He opened his mouth to tell Tasha to calm down, but she immediately shot him a lethal glare that forced him to swallow his words. They were a complete disaster. If you were standing in the center of that lobby watching this unfold, the sheer audacity of these people would have made your head spin. They were standing in a building I practically owned, throwing tantrums like spoiled toddlers, weaponizing the sacred concept of family loyalty, while actively trying to intimidate me into handing over a $100 million empire. They genuinely believed that if they made enough noise, if they invoked the concept of a mother's love and the unbreakable bond of family, I would suddenly crumble under the weight of social pressure. They thought they could guilt me into giving them absolutely everything they wanted, just like they had done for the last 5 years of my marriage. But I was not crumbling. I was sitting comfortably on the curved velvet sofa in my penthouse, looking at the massive flat-screen television mounted on the wall. The screen was divided into a grid displaying the live high-definition security feeds from the lobby cameras. I held a crystal glass of sparkling water in one hand, watching the pathetic circus unfold in real time. I watched Marcus, pacing back and forth furiously yelling at Charles about his stolen shares. I watched his mother performing her best theatrical crying routine, dabbing her dry eyes with a crumpled tissue. I watched Tasha practically foaming at the mouth, threatening to call the authorities on me. The intercom on my glass coffee table chimed softly. I leaned forward and pressed the silver button. "Miss Jenkins," Charles said, his voice remaining perfectly calm despite the aggressive screaming happening in the background of the call. "I have 4 unauthorized individuals in the lobby causing a severe disturbance. They are claiming to be your immediate relatives. They are refusing to leave the premises. Shall I dispatch the police to have them permanently removed for trespassing?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. I looked at the security feed, watching Marcus pointing his finger aggressively at the camera above the desk, knowing I was probably watching. "No, Charles," I replied, my voice completely steady and totally devoid of any emotion. "Do not call the police just yet. Let them stay down there in the lobby for a few more minutes. They came all this way looking for a massive family resolution, and I am going to give them exactly what they asked for, but I am not coming down." I ended the intercom call and set my crystal glass down on the table. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the direct number for my lead corporate attorney. He was already in the building, sitting patiently in a private business lounge just 2 floors below the penthouse, waiting for my exact signal. I gave him the green light to proceed. I was not going to grace my toxic ex-family with my physical presence. I was not going to stand in a public lobby and scream back at people who had spent half a decade treating me like absolute dirt beneath their expensive shoes. I was not going to let them use fake tears and emotional manipulation to drag me back into their twisted reality. I was going to let the cold, hard, brutal reality of the American legal system speak for me. Down in the lobby, the tense atmosphere was reaching an absolute boiling point. Marcus was leaning aggressively over the mahogany desk, threatening to physically jump over the polished surface. Tasha was right beside him, holding her phone up and threatening to go live on social media to expose the building management. Charles the concierge simply stood there with his hands clasped behind his back, completely unfazed by their amateur theatrics. Then the soft electronic chime of the private VIP elevator echoed across the marble floors. The heavy stainless steel doors began to slide open. Marcus instantly stopped yelling. Tasha lowered her phone. His mother quickly adjusted her posture, wiping her fake tears and standing tall, fully expecting to see me step out of the elevator cabin. They were all completely prepared to launch into another aggressive guilt trip the moment I walked into the lobby, but I did not step out of that elevator. Instead, a tall older gentleman walked out onto the marble floor. He was wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal gray suit, a crisp white shirt, and a deep burgundy silk tie. He carried himself with the lethal, calculated precision of a man who billed thousands of dollars by the hour. This was Arthur Sterling, my lead corporate litigation attorney. He did not look angry. He did not look intimidated. He looked at my furious ex-family the exact same way a pest control expert looks at a severe termite infestation. He held 2 incredibly thin black leather folders in his right hand. Marcus immediately puffed out his chest and marched toward Arthur, trying to physically block his path. "Who the hell are you?" Marcus demanded, his voice booming across the quiet lobby. "Are you one of Maya's little errand boys? Go back upstairs and tell her to come down here and face me herself. I am not negotiating a $100 million corporate dispute with a messenger." Arthur stopped walking. He did not take a step back, and he certainly did not look up at Marcus with an ounce of respect. He slowly looked Marcus up and down, taking in the ruined suit, the missing tie, and the desperate, sweating face. "I am not here to negotiate with you, Mr. Jenkins," Arthur replied, his voice incredibly deep and perfectly smooth, carrying absolutely zero emotion. "I am the lead counsel representing Vanguard X Management Trust, and given your current legal predicament regarding multiple counts of corporate embezzlement and gross financial malfeasance, I highly advise you to step out of my way before I add physical harassment to your rapidly growing list of federal charges." Marcus froze. The sheer authority in Arthur's voice hit him like a physical blow. The mention of federal charges immediately deflated his aggressive posture. He took a slow, hesitant step backward, allowing my attorney to walk right past him. Arthur did not even spare Marcus a second glance. He walked directly toward the center of the lobby where Tasha, Brad, and Marcus's mother were standing in stunned silence. Arthur stopped a few feet away from the group. He looked directly at the older woman who was still clutching her oversized designer handbag to her chest. "Are you Eleanor Jenkins?" he asked formally, verifying her identity. The mother blinked rapidly, clearly caught off guard by the sudden shift in the situation. She looked at Marcus, who was still standing completely paralyzed near the elevator, and then looked back at Arthur. "Yes," she answered, her voice trembling slightly but quickly regaining her manufactured sense of self-importance. "I am Marcus's mother, and I am Maya's mother-in-law. If she sent you down here to offer a financial settlement or a formal apology, you can tell her that she needs to deliver it to my face. I am not accepting any legal documents until she looks me in the eye and explains why she is trying to destroy my son." Arthur did not engage with her emotional grandstanding. He did not care about her maternal pride or her demands for an apology. He simply extended his arm and held out the first thin black leather folder. "My client is not offering an apology, Mrs. Jenkins." Arthur stated, his tone completely clinical. "And she is certainly not offering a financial settlement. My client dispatched me to personally deliver this official legal notification so that you would have adequate time to make necessary living arrangements." The mother frowned, looking down at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. She slowly reached out her hand, shaking slightly, and took the leather-bound document. Tasha leaned in incredibly close, peering over her mother's shoulder. Brad, on the other hand, took a massive step backward, his face turning completely white. He knew exactly what was inside that folder. He knew the absolute devastation that was about to be unleashed. The mother flipped open the folder. Inside was a stack of heavy legal papers, stamped with the official red seal of the county clerk's office. She stared at the bold black text at the top of the very first page, Notice of Default and Intent to Foreclose. Her breath hitched in her throat. She read the property address listed on the document. It was her house, the sprawling, beautiful home she had lived in for the last 30 years, the home where she had raised Marcus and Tasha. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice cracking completely. Her eyes frantically scanned the dense legal jargon, desperately searching for a mistake. There has to be a clerical error. I own my house free and clear. My late husband paid off the mortgage 5 years ago. I do not owe the bank a single dollar. Why is there a foreclosure notice with my name on it? Arthur clasped his hands in front of him, maintaining his icy professional demeanor. "There is no clerical error, Mrs. Jenkins," he explained loudly enough for the entire lobby to hear. 6 months ago, your son-in-law, Brad, executed a commercial loan agreement for $300,000 to fund his private business venture. To secure that capital, he provided a signed property deed and authorized a secondary lien on your primary residence. He utilized your home as collateral. The mother slowly turned her head and looked at Brad. Brad was visibly shaking, sweating profusely, and looking desperately toward the exit doors. He did not say a word. He could not defend himself because every single word Arthur said was the absolute truth. "You forged my signature!" the mother gasped, staring at Brad with wide, horrified eyes. "You put my house on the line for your stupid beer company!" "The commercial loan went into severe default 3 weeks ago," Arthur continued, completely ignoring the domestic drama erupting in front of him, reading the facts like a lethal weather report. "The 90-day grace period has officially expired. My client, the Vanguard X Management Trust, recently acquired the distressed debt portfolio containing that specific commercial loan. Because the borrower has failed to make any payments, the trust is legally exercising its right to seize the collateral property. The bank is not taking your house, Mrs. Jenkins. My client is taking your house. You have exactly 30 days to vacate the premises before the county sheriff arrives to physically remove your belongings and change the locks." The words hit the older woman like a massive freight train. 30 days to vacate. The realization that she was completely broke, that her own son-in-law had stolen her financial security, and that the daughter-in-law she had always treated with absolute disdain was now legally evicting her, was simply too much for her brain to process. The thick legal folder slipped from her hands, hitting the marble floor with a heavy slap. She let out a soft, wheezing gasp. Her eyes rolled to the back of her head. Her knees completely buckled beneath her. "Mom!" Tasha screamed, lunging forward in a desperate panic. But Tasha was not fast enough. The mother collapsed, falling hard onto the polished Italian marble floor. She fainted right there in the center of the ultra-luxury lobby, the victim of her own family's profound greed and bottomless deceit. The immaculate quiet of the lobby was instantly shattered by Tasha's piercing, hysterical screams. She dropped to her knees beside her unconscious mother, frantically shaking her shoulders and slapping her cheeks, trying to wake her up. Marcus snapped out of his paralyzed state and sprinted across the lobby, dropping to the floor next to them. He started yelling at Charles to call for an ambulance immediately. The perfectly curated image of the upper echelon Jenkins family was totally annihilated. They were sprawled out on the floor of a building they could not afford, crying over a house they no longer owned, ruined by a white man they had blindly trusted. Brad remained standing a few feet away, completely frozen in absolute terror. He looked at the unconscious woman on the floor and then looked at Arthur Sterling. The corporate attorney did not offer to help. He did not pull out his phone to call emergency services. He simply stepped gracefully around the fainting woman, his expensive leather shoes completely avoiding the dropped legal folder. Arthur still held the second thin black leather folder in his hand. The nightmare for this toxic family was only halfway over. Arthur Sterling did not even blink as Eleanor Jenkins lay unconscious at his expensive leather shoes. He possessed absolutely no sympathy for a woman who had spent years enabling her abusive son while looking down her nose at everyone else. He simply adjusted his burgundy silk tie and looked down at Tasha, who was currently kneeling on the polished marble floor, frantically sobbing over her mother's motionless body. Tasha looked up at the corporate attorney, her mascara running in dark, ugly streaks down her cheeks. Her eyes were filled with a desperate, pleading panic, but Arthur was not there to offer comfort. He was there to execute a final legal execution. He looked at Tasha with absolute clinical disdain. He raised the second thin black leather folder, and with a sharp flick of his wrist, he tossed it directly at her. The folder struck Tasha squarely in the chest with a heavy thud before bouncing into her lap. The leather flap sprang open, and a thick stack of glossy 8x10 photographs slid out, scattering violently across the pristine Italian marble floor right next to her unconscious mother's head. Tasha gasped, recoiling instinctively from the photographs as if they were physically burning her. But her eyes were immediately drawn to the high-resolution images. These were not legal documents or dense financial contracts. These were crisp, brightly lit photographs taken by a highly paid private investigator. Tasha reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the photograph closest to her knee. The image was crystal clear. It showed the front entrance of the ultra-exclusive Peninsula Hotel downtown. The bright red digital timestamp printed in the bottom corner of the photograph indicated that it had been taken exactly yesterday afternoon at 3 o'clock. Right in the center of the frame, walking through the gilded revolving doors, was her husband, Brad. He was wearing his favorite vintage t-shirt and a tailored blazer, looking incredibly smug. But he was not alone. Wrapped tightly around his arm, clinging to his side with an intimate familiarity, was a young, beautiful woman. She was wearing a tight designer bandage dress and carrying a massive luxury shopping bag. Tasha stared at the woman's face. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. She knew that face. She knew those long, expensive hair extensions. She knew the heavy gold Cartier bracelet stacked on the woman's wrist. It was Chloe. It was the 24-year-old Instagram model that her brother Marcus had been parading around for the last 8 months. It was Marcus's mistress. Tasha slowly picked up a second photograph. This one was taken inside the hotel lobby near the private elevators. Brad had his hand placed firmly on the lower curve of Chloe's back, leaning in close to whisper something in her ear while she giggled brightly. The third photograph showed them stepping into the elevator together, their bodies pressed intimately against one another. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the immediate area of the lobby. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the rapid, ragged breathing coming from Tasha's lungs. She completely let go of her mother's shoulders. She slowly stood up, the glossy photographs clutched tightly in her shaking fists. The profound grief over her mother's medical emergency instantly evaporated, entirely consumed by a blinding radioactive rage. Brad had been backing away slowly, desperately hoping to slip out the front doors in the confusion, but he froze when Tasha turned to face him. Her expression was completely unrecognizable. The spoiled, entitled society wife was completely gone, replaced by a woman who had just had her entire reality torn to absolute shreds. In the span of exactly 5 minutes, she had learned that her husband had secretly stolen her mother's house, bankrupted their family, and was actively spending his afternoons sleeping with her brother's young mistress. Tasha, please listen to me," Brad stammered, taking another panicked step backward, holding his hands up defensively. "Those photos are completely taken out of context. It is not what it looks like. I swear to you. We just happened to run into each other downtown, and we were just grabbing a quick drink to talk about Marcus. You know I would never do something like that to you." Tasha did not say a single word. She closed the distance between them with terrifying speed. She did not yell or scream or cause a theatrical scene. She simply raised her right hand, drew it back as far as she could, and swung it forward with every single ounce of physical strength she possessed. The slap echoed through the cavernous marble lobby with the sharp crack of a fired pistol. The sheer force of the impact snapped Brad's head violently to the side. A spray of blood erupted from his split lip, splattering across the pristine white collar of his shirt. He stumbled sideways, crashing heavily into a tall brass luggage cart. Tasha did not stop. She threw the glossy photographs directly into his bleeding face, letting them flutter around him like toxic confetti. "You parasitic piece of trash!" she finally screamed, her voice tearing her throat raw. "You stole my mother's home to fund your pathetic failures, and you used her money to take my brother's trashy little mistress to a 5-star hotel. You are a disgusting, broke, cowardly fraud." The glossy photos scattered across the floor near Marcus's feet. Marcus had been kneeling next to his mother, completely paralyzed by the sudden medical emergency. But the sound of Tasha's scream and the mention of his mistress snapped him out of his shock. He looked down at this marble floor. Staring right back up at him was a high-definition image of his loyal, beautiful girlfriend Chloe, pressing herself intimately against his freeloading brother-in-law. He saw the Cartier bracelets he had bought for her using embezzled corporate funds. He saw the exact dress she had worn when she told him she was staying in for the night. Marcus's brain completely short-circuited. He had already lost his massive tech company. He had lost his personal wealth. He was facing federal prison time. The only single thing he thought he still possessed in this world was the loyalty of the young, gorgeous woman he had ruined his marriage for. And now, sitting right in front of him, was the undeniable photographic proof that the moment his credit card stopped working, she had immediately spread her legs for the closest available wallet. And that wallet just happened to belong to the man who had stolen his mother's house. A primal, guttural roar erupted from deep inside Marcus's chest. It was the sound of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose, completely surrendering to madness. He did not even bother standing up properly. He practically scrambled across the marble floor, lunging at Brad like a starving wild animal. He tackled Brad with such ferocious momentum that both men crashed through a massive decorative display of exotic orchids. Heavy ceramic pots shattered violently, launching dirt-thick roots and sharp shards of pottery all over the pristine floor. "You slept with her!" Marcus bellowed, wrapping his hands tightly around Brad's throat and squeezing with lethal intent. "You broke, pathetic leech. You slept with my girl while I was paying your bills. I am going to kill you. I am going to end your miserable life right here." Brad choked, clawing desperately at Marcus's thick wrists, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. Tasha did not try to pull her brother off. Instead, she joined the chaotic frenzy, kicking Brad viciously in the ribs with her pointed designer heels, screaming uncontrollably about her mother's house and his infidelity. The three of them rolled around in the wet potting soil and the shattered ceramic, tearing at each other's clothes, drawing blood, and screaming profanities. The irony was absolutely magnificent. Just 10 minutes ago, this exact same family had proudly marched into my lobby demanding that I come downstairs to face them. They had loudly invoked the sacred bonds of family loyalty. They had tried to weaponize the concept of a mother's love and the strict moral superiority of their upper echelon lifestyle to guilt me into surrendering. They had presented themselves as a united, unbreakable front of traditional family values. Now they were physically destroying each other, rolling in dirt and blood on the floor of a public building. They were tearing each other apart over a stolen house, a failed beer company, and a cheap, opportunistic mistress. Their masks had not just slipped off, they had been completely incinerated. Charles, the concierge, calmly picked up the phone on his desk and finally dialed the police requesting immediate assistance for a violent domestic disturbance. Arthur Sterling simply straightened his burgundy tie, stepped carefully over a scattered pile of dirty photographs, and walked calmly back toward the private elevators. His job was officially done. Upstairs in the quiet luxury of my penthouse, I watched the entire spectacular collapse on my high-definition security monitors. I watched the police arrive and physically drag Marcus and Brad apart. I watched the paramedics finally load Eleanor onto a stretcher. I took a slow, refreshing sip of my sparkling water. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or regret. I had not forced any of them to cheat, lie, or steal. I had merely turned on the lights in a very dark room and let the cockroaches devour each other. I set my crystal glass down on the thick glass coffee table. The grand finale of this pathetic tragedy was unfolding right downstairs in my lobby, but watching it through a high-definition security monitor suddenly felt entirely insufficient. Some victories demanded to be witnessed in person. Some absolute destructions required you to look your enemy directly in the eye while they burned. I stood up from my velvet sofa, smoothing the front of my immaculate, tailored dark navy power suit. I slipped my feet into a pair of sharp black stiletto heels, grabbed a crisp white envelope from my mahogany desk, and walked slowly toward the private elevator. The ride down to the ground floor took exactly 45 seconds. I spent those seconds breathing in the quiet, realizing that the heavy, suffocating weight of the Jenkins family was finally, permanently lifted from my shoulders. The soft electronic chime of the elevator echoed through the lobby. The heavy stainless steel doors slowly slid apart, revealing the absolute disaster zone my ex-family had created. The police had successfully separated Marcus and Brad, holding them on opposite sides of the massive room. The paramedics were just wheeling Eleanor's stretcher through the sliding glass front doors. Tasha was sitting on a plush velvet lobby chair, holding a plastic ice pack to her bruised face, her expensive designer dress completely ruined by wet potting soil and her husband's blood. The moment the elevator doors opened, every single head in the room turned toward me. The heavy, chaotic noise of police radios and overlapping desperate arguments immediately died down. I stepped out of the elevator. The sharp, rhythmic click of my heels against the polished Italian marble was the only sound echoing in the cavernous space. I walked with the slow, measured pace of a queen inspecting a conquered battlefield. I did not look angry. I did not look vindicated or smug. I looked down at them with the cold, detached curiosity you might reserve for an insect struggling helplessly on its back. Marcus was breathing heavily, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back by a very unamused police officer. He had completely lost his mind during the physical brawl, and the police had clearly decided he was an active physical threat. His custom-tailored suit, the one he had worn to the luxury car dealership to humiliate me just hours ago, was ripped to shreds at the seams. His face was deeply bruised and covered in dark dirt from the shattered orchid display. He looked at me, and for the first time in the entire history of our relationship, I saw genuine absolute terror in his dark eyes. He finally understood the sheer magnitude of the apex predator he had carelessly invited into his life. "Maya," he gasped, his voice barely a raspy, broken whisper. His chest heaved as he struggled uselessly against the heavy metal handcuffs. "Please tell the officers to let me go. Tell them this is just a massive family misunderstanding. You cannot let them take me to jail. I will lose absolutely everything." I stopped walking, standing exactly 3 feet away from him. I looked him up and down, taking in the absolute destruction of his fake, upper echelon persona. "You already lost everything, Marcus," I replied, my voice perfectly smooth and incredibly quiet. "The jail cell is just your final destination. You put those heavy steel handcuffs on yourself the moment you decided my loyalty was something you could easily discard for a 24-year-old girl." I slowly turned my attention to Brad. He was sitting heavily on the edge of a shattered ceramic planter, holding a bloody rag to his split lip. A different police officer was standing over him, taking down his formal statement. Brad completely refused to make eye contact with me. The arrogant white man who had boldly told me to go back to my Southside hood just 48 hours ago was now staring at the marble floor, trembling like a frightened child. He knew I held the absolute power to not only take his mother-in-law's house, but to completely destroy whatever miserable, pathetic life he had left. Tasha suddenly stood up, dropping the plastic ice pack onto the floor. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at me, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You planned this," she hissed, her voice thick with venom and fresh tears. "You set those private investigators on my husband. You bought my mother's commercial debt just to humiliate us in public. You are a sick, twisted psychopath, Maya. We took you in, we gave you a family and a seat at our table." I slowly turned to face her. I did not raise my voice a single decibel, but the sheer absolute authority in my tone made her physically step back. "You gave me a prison, Tasha," I corrected her coldly. "You gave me 5 long years of constant disrespect, microaggressions, and thinly veiled racism. You sat at my dining table, drinking expensive wine I paid for while constantly whispering about how I was not good enough for your visionary brother. You all happily rode the gravy train while pretending you were the ones laying the tracks. I did not make your husband sleep with a young Instagram model in a downtown hotel. I did not forge your mother's legal signature on a commercial loan document. I just stopped protecting your family from the brutal consequences of your own pathetic choices." Tasha opened her mouth to scream another vicious insult, but absolutely no words came out. She completely collapsed back into the plush lobby chair, covering her face with her dirty hands and sobbing uncontrollably. The absolute, crushing reality of her situation had finally destroyed the last remaining ounce of her fake high society pride. She had no husband she could trust, no mother to run to, and no wealthy brother to fund her lifestyle. I looked around the ruined lobby. The shattered expensive orchids, the dark potting soil, the drops of blood, and the bitter tears. It was a beautiful, tragic masterpiece of their own making. I reached into the pocket of my tailored navy suit jacket and pulled out the crisp white envelope. It contained the final item on my strategic agenda. Marcus watched the envelope with wide, terrified eyes. "What is that?" he choked out, practically gagging on his own rising panic. "What else could you possibly take from me? I am in handcuffs, Maya." I stepped closer to him, looking directly into his bruised, sweating face. I held the envelope out, holding it elegantly between my index and middle finger. "This is the final invoice from Arthur Sterling's corporate litigation firm." I explained, my voice ringing clear and authoritative across the quiet lobby. "It outlines the exact legal fees incurred during the hostile takeover of your former tech company. The total comes to exactly $50,000, and according to the extremely strict indemnification clauses you completely violated when you embezzled corporate funds to buy Cartier bracelets, the terminated chief executive officer is personally responsible for all hostile acquisition legal fees." Marcus stared at the white envelope as if it were a loaded weapon pointed directly at his chest. "I do not have $50,000, he whispered, his voice breaking completely. "You know I do not have a single dollar left. My accounts are permanently frozen." I simply smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that did not reach my eyes. I slowly opened my fingers and let the crisp, white envelope fall. It fluttered gracefully through the air, landing directly in the wet potting soil and blood, right at Marcus's expensive ruined shoes. "Forward this to your new addresses," I said, turning my back on him with absolute finality. "Oh, wait, none of you have houses anymore." I did not wait for his reaction. I did not care to hear his pathetic sobbing or Tasha's hysterical screaming ever again. I looked directly at Charles, the head concierge, who was standing safely behind his massive mahogany desk. "Charles," I instructed, my voice commanding absolute total obedience, "I am completely finished down here. Instruct the police officers to throw the rest of this trash out onto the street and send the entire lobby cleaning bill directly to my accountant." "Yes, Ms. Jenkins," Charles replied immediately, giving me a deep, highly respectful nod. I walked back to the private elevator, my head held high, my spine perfectly straight. I stepped inside the polished stainless steel cabin and pressed the button for the penthouse. As the heavy metal doors began to slide shut, I caught one final glimpse of Marcus Jenkins. The police officers were roughly hauling him to his feet, dragging him toward the glass exit doors, and the flashing red and blue lights waiting outside in the dark. The heavy doors closed completely, sealing off the noise and the chaos permanently. I rode the elevator up to the top floor entirely alone. The silence was absolute perfection, and I was finally completely free. 1 month later, the dust had finally settled over the absolute wreckage of the Jenkins family. The spectacular collapse of their fake upper echelon empire happened with terrifying speed. For Marcus, the fall from the penthouse to the pavement was permanent. He was currently living in a dingy extended-stay motel on the outskirts of the city, his leased luxury vehicles long gone repossessed by the bank. He had desperately tried to leverage his former title to secure a new executive position, but the tech industry is a surprisingly small world. The brutal details of his forensic audit and the pending federal embezzlement charges had leaked, completely blacklisting him from every single reputable firm in the country. He spent his days sitting on a sagging mattress, staring blankly at a small television, surrounded by cheap takeout containers, completely isolated and drowning in a massive ocean of legal debt he could never hope to repay. Chloe, true to her parasitic nature, had not wasted a single second mourning the loss of her wealthy host. She had immediately latched onto a minor local rapper who flashed large stacks of cash on social media. She had moved into his rented condo, fully expecting a seamless transition into her next luxury lifestyle. But Brad, nursing a broken jaw and a heart full of vindictive rage, had completely ruined her backup plan. He had anonymously posted the private investigator photos of Chloe and himself directly to a popular local gossip blog. He included a detailed timeline proving she had been actively sleeping with him while Marcus was paying her rent. The rapper, desperate to protect his own fragile public image, had immediately kicked Chloe out onto the street, changing the locks and posting a highly humiliating video of her dragging her heavy designer suitcases down the sidewalk. Her carefully curated Instagram following evaporated overnight, completely destroying her primary source of income and her fake social currency. Meanwhile, the divorce proceedings between Tasha and Brad were rapidly devolving into an absolute bloodbath. They were no longer fighting over expensive assets or luxury vacations. They were fighting over absolute pennies. The commercial brewery was completely dead, the equipment auctioned off to cover a tiny fraction of the massive debt. Tasha's mother, Eleanor, had been legally evicted from her sprawling home and was now living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in the suburbs, her health rapidly declining from the stress. Tasha was actively trying to sue Brad for the emotional distress and the loss of the house, while Brad was countersuing, claiming he had been forced into the fraudulent loan by his wife's extravagant spending habits. They spent their days screaming at each other in dingy mediation rooms, their toxic marriage reduced to nothing more than a pile of unpaid bills and mutual hatred. The polished, wealthy family that had proudly tried to humiliate me at a luxury restaurant was now completely unrecognizable, torn to absolute pieces by their own bottomless greed. A few weeks after the absolute chaos in the lobby, my phone rang late one evening. The caller ID displayed an unknown number, but I knew exactly who it was. I let it ring twice before I calmly answered the call, pressing the phone to my ear but remaining completely silent. "Maya, please do not hang up." Marcus begged, his voice trembling and thick with tears. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by the pathetic whimper of a man who had absolutely nothing left. "I just need 5 minutes of your time. Please, just listen to me." I did not speak. I leaned back against the plush velvet cushions of my sofa, looking out at the glittering Chicago skyline. "I am so sorry, Maya," he cried, the desperation rolling off him in waves. "I have lost absolutely everything. My company, my money, my reputation. I am living in a miserable motel room and I am terrified. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. Oh, but you are my wife. We built our lives together. We came from nothing together. You have always been so strong, so forgiving. You are the only person who ever truly loved me, for me. Please, Maya, you cannot just leave me here to rot. You have to help me." He was desperately trying to play his final card. He was trying to weaponize our shared history and invoke the toxic expectation that I, as a strong black woman, was somehow obligated to absorb his abuse and rescue him from the consequences of his own terrible choices. He wanted me to be his savior, his safety net, his absolute rock. He wanted me to forget the humiliation, the betrayal, and the sheer cruelty he had inflicted on me because it was suddenly convenient for him. I let his pathetic crying echo through the phone for a few more seconds before I finally spoke. My voice was incredibly calm, completely devoid of anger or pity. "I am strong, Marcus," I replied, the words falling like cold, heavy stones. "But I am not your savior, and I am certainly not your wife anymore. You made your choices, and now you have to live inside the absolute destruction you created." I pulled the phone away from my ear, ignoring his frantic screaming, and pressed the red button. I immediately opened my settings and permanently blocked the number. It was a completely clinical, total severance of the toxic dynamic that had poisoned my life for 5 years. I did not shed a single tear. I just set my phone down and went back to enjoying the quiet, peaceful silence of my own beautiful life. The final chapter of his absolute destruction happened exactly 2 months after that pathetic, desperate phone call. Chicago is a truly beautiful city, but it can be incredibly unforgiving when the weather turns hostile. It was a miserable Tuesday afternoon. The sky was the color of bruised iron, and a freezing torrential rain was pouring down over the downtown financial district. The wind was howling fiercely off Lake Michigan, cutting through the concrete canyons and biting directly into the bones of anyone unlucky enough to be caught outside. Marcus was one of the unlucky ones. He was standing under the small, rusted metal awning of a city public transit bus stop, right on the edge of the luxury shopping district he used to frequent on a daily basis. He was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant tech chief executive who had once loudly demanded attention at the car dealership. He was no longer wearing crisp, tailored suits or expensive imported silk ties. Instead, he was huddled against the cold wind, wearing a cheap, ill-fitting gray jacket that offered absolutely no protection from the biting chill. His posture was completely defeated. His shoulders were slumped heavily, his head hung low, and his thin canvas shoes were completely soaked through with dirty, freezing city water. He was shivering violently, clutching a battered plastic grocery bag holding the few miserable items he could currently afford from a local discount store. He stood there watching the wealthy professionals hurry past him under their massive black golf umbrellas. He looked up at the towering glass skyscrapers that pierced the low gray clouds. Just a few short months ago, he had occupied a massive corner office in one of those very buildings, looking down at the entire city like a god. Now he was nothing more than a ghost, haunting the exact same streets he used to rule, waiting for a delayed public bus to take him back to a depressing, roach-infested motel on the absolute outskirts of town. He was entirely broken physically, mentally, and financially. Through the heavy rhythmic drumming of the torrential rain, a new sound suddenly cut through the miserable city noise. It was a deep, powerful, guttural growl, the unmistakable aggressive roar of a massive twin turbocharged engine echoing sharply off the wet concrete buildings. Marcus slowly lifted his heavy head, blinking through the freezing rain that was streaming down his face. Gliding down the flooded street, cutting through the terrible weather like a flawless silver bullet, was a hypercar. It was not just any luxury vehicle. It was a sleek, stunning silver McLaren. It was the exact same $2 million machine that Marcus had arrogantly tried to purchase for his mistress on the day his entire fake empire collapsed. The water beaded beautifully off its custom ceramic coating, making the car look like an alien spaceship against the backdrop of the gray, miserable city. The McLaren did not speed past the rusted bus stop. As it approached the shelter, the massive engine purred down to a low, menacing idle. The driver deliberately swerved the wide silver vehicle slightly to the right, bringing the massive custom wheels incredibly close to the concrete curb. The heavy performance tires hit a deep, pooling puddle of dirty street water with absolute precision. A massive, thick wave of freezing gray sludge erupted from the asphalt, splashing violently over the curb and hitting Marcus directly below his knees. The dirty water soaked entirely through his cheap pants and flooded into his already ruined shoes. Marcus let out a loud, furious shout of absolute misery. He dropped his plastic grocery bag onto the wet pavement and stepped forward, ready to scream every single profanity he knew at the careless driver of the exotic car. He raised his trembling fist, his face contorted in bitter, angry rage. The silver McLaren came to a complete dead stop right in front of him. The massive, sleek brake lights glowed a bright, aggressive red through the heavy falling rain. For a brief second, Marcus just stared at the incredibly beautiful piece of automotive engineering, his anger momentarily giving way to a sickening wave of deep, nostalgic jealousy. Then the tinted passenger side window slowly began to glide down. The interior of the cabin was an absolute vision of warm, luxurious comfort. The ambient lighting cast a soft golden glow over the pristine custom leather seats, completely isolated from the storm outside. But Marcus was not looking at the expensive interior. His eyes were locked entirely on the driver. I was sitting behind the carbon fiber steering wheel. I was wearing a tailored black designer coat, and even though the sky outside was incredibly dark and completely overcast, I was wearing a pair of sharp, oversized, dark sunglasses. I looked completely flawless, perfectly insulated from the freezing misery of the world outside. I did not turn my head completely. I simply tilted my chin down just a fraction, looking at him right over the rim of my dark lenses. Marcus froze. His raised fist slowly dropped to his side. His mouth opened in absolute stunned shock, but the freezing rain completely stole his voice. He realized in that exact agonizing second that he was looking at the woman he had carelessly thrown away, standing freezing in the gutter while she literally drove away in his wildest dream. I did not say a single word to him. I did not need to. I just looked at his ruined clothes, his wet, shivering frame, and the absolute total despair in his eyes. I gave him one slow, deliberate nod of acknowledgement, followed by a razor-sharp, incredibly cold smirk. Before he could even react, I pressed my foot down hard on the accelerator. The $2 million engine exploded with a deafening, violent roar that physically shook the concrete foundation of the bus stop. The massive rear tires spun for a fraction of a second, gripping the wet asphalt before the silver machine rocketed forward, tearing down the slick city street and disappearing entirely into the gray, heavy rain. I left him standing there completely alone, drenched in dirty water and absolute, utter humiliation. The memory of his face standing in that freezing rain is something I will always cherish. I am sitting back here now in the absolute quiet of my downtown penthouse. The heavy storm is still raging outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, but up here above the clouds, the world is perfectly still. The camera slowly begins to pull back, gliding smoothly across the room, revealing the minimalist but incredibly wealthy details of my sanctuary. I reach forward and pick up my heavy crystal glass from the polished glass coffee table. The massive square ice cube clinks softly against the side. I take one final slow sip of the rich, dark bourbon, feeling the warm, smooth burn settle deeply into my chest. I look directly into the camera lens, my expression completely calm and totally unapologetic. Some say I am ruthless, but sometimes the only way to deal with a traitor is to buy his life and throw it in the trash. The screen cuts instantly to pitch black. A heavy, aggressive hip-hop beat immediately drops, shaking the speakers with absolute power.